We're going to talk today about free online newspaper websites. And if you are not aware of this situation, if you think of newspapers being something that Ancestry has and some of the other websites have, then you might be amazed to find out how many different places you can look. So we'll get right into it. First of all, I have to acknowledge that there are a lot of newspapers, and you can see who this is Ancestry's newspapers.com, which gets highly publicized. And if you use Ancestry, you'll get searched into this newspapers, and they'll come up and say you've got a wonderful article about your ancestor, except you have to subscribe to newspapers.com to see it. So it's a little bit enticing, but kind of a little bit frustrating unless you have enough of those that you go ahead and get a subscription. But one of the things they're doing, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, is they've developed some extremely, not just Ancestry, but the uh, technological community, the larger community that's working with artificial intelligence, has developed lots of different things that have enabled Ancestry to dramatically speed up the amount of information that they're gaining from the newspapers, and adding up this year, at least what they're saying is another 15 billion records onto their website. And it's probable, I've seen the new records coming on, and it's pretty impressive. In fact, I don't know if I've included a shot here, but if you go to ancestry.com and get into their card catalog and look for the new records that are coming in, it's very impressive how fast this new technology is allowing them to get detailed indexes of all the newspapers that they're digitizing. So basically, this is one option, and there are other commercial newspaper collections online. But I wanted to focus on the fact that there are quite a bit. And what I'm saying here is you might want to bite the bullet and get a paid subscription because there are some advantages, and there's a lot of information in newspapers.com. But we're going to talk about some issues here. And one of the issues that I'm going to show you, because I'm going to go through a lot of websites here, and inevitably at the end of this presentation, people ask me, well, do you have a handout? Well, I do, but it's posted on the BYU Library Family History Center website. But the fact is, you can do this with any video. And the first thing you can do is stop the video and look for an address or name of the website that you happen to want to look at if you're interested in this. For example, here's one. This is an example of a website, New York Historic Newspapers.org. And most of these websites will require a login and a password. So as you find lots of websites, if you're doing a lot of research, you'll find that you have to have a lot of different logins and passwords. But this one collection, this one has 13 million pages of New York newspapers, and over 13.7 million. And so when you're watching this on YouTube, you can stop, go pause, and then you have a chance to either do a screenshot. That means pull out your phone and take a picture of the screen, or use a program on your screen from your computer to do a screenshot. If you have a PC or a Mac, there are ways to use key commands that will give you a cursor that will let you do a screenshot of the screen. That way you have a copy of the startup page for the website, and that will include a copy of the URL, the address to that particular website. So once you have that, then going to and looking through a lot of websites becomes much easier, and especially capturing information from video presentations like this is pretty simple and straightforward. This is the actual address of this particular website. I may have not gotten all of them, but that's why I said you can go to them by using the name of the website also, which gets you there. So it's easier to do that sometimes than it is to try to type out a long URL or address. And once again, if you use your smartphone, I have to add a little caution there if it's permitted during the presentation or when watching a video. In this presentation, it is permitted. You can take screenshots, you can copy, you can do whatever you want with the information that's here. And so that's why when we're online like this, but that's not the case with everyone. And we certainly don't want to get in the problem of people making unauthorized smartphone shots or screenshots. So you need to be cautious of that. And usually, if they don't want a screenshot, they will say it. But be aware of another part of that, and that everything on the internet, literally everything, is copy protected, is part of copyright. So I would caution people from using any of the material online for your own commercial purposes unless you're very clear as to whether you have the right to do that, because that's not a good idea. That's a whole nother subject, unfortunately. We can't get into it too far. Just kind of understand this, that newspaper websites are scattered all over the internet, all over the world, and all over the internet, all over the world. So it's not a situation where you're going to have one place that will tell you where everything is, or that all the lists, and you'll find lists of free newspapers and things like that. Believe me, they're not exhaustive. They're never, I've never seen one place yet. There may be something that I'm not aware of out there, always is, that would say everything about every newspaper, but that's probably not the case. But most of these websites are scattered all over the internet. Now, it's not unusual, by the way, that there are websites, and I'm aware of them. I'm not going to mention any names, but there are websites out there who basically take public domain information, which is literally free and is sometimes even freely available online, and then put it in their website and call it copyrighted and then sell that to you. So you need to be kind of a little bit aware that if you find something in one website, or you think it's in a website, and it says there's a paywall or a subscription fee or whatever to get to that image, they sell the images one by one in many cases, then it's a good idea to go out and look for that image on kind of a general search. And some of the large public domain image sites may have that image. And when you're talking about newspapers, you have the same situation. There are available newspaper programs, and some of those newspaper programs are included. The ones that are free are included in the paid subscription programs. So this is a good idea to look for free ones, and then if you really need information and you need the more convenience of having a large website that's a paywall website, a subscription website, that you take the time that then you have to make your own decision as to whether or not you want to pay the subscription price. Now, the basis of all this is optical character recognition. What this means is that when you take a picture of the newspaper page, then using optical character recognition, it will take that information and turn that into a digital file of all the information on the page. Now, part of the situation with OCR is that it makes it searchable in a sense, but it depends on the fact that the image in there does not mean that it's been run through the program, the OCR program, and made searchable. So that's kind of the advantage that these websites have to offer, is that if they have the pictures, but they may not have every word searchable, or they may have some kind of limited search. And what's happening out there in the world today is that there's what's called enhanced computer aided indexing. It's called CAI. And it works with the optical character recognition to identify every term. In other words, it does the indexing. So it picks out all the names and it picks out all the dates and all the places and puts them together in a meaningful index. So if you started looking for your ancestor's name plus a date and a place, you could search through the whole collection and it would match any of the terms to all of the information in that database. And anything else. You can search by occupations, you could search by company names, you could search by, and literally this enhanced computer aided indexing has, technically it has unlimited categories of searching. So it makes it so it's not like doing a web search with Google search. It's a little bit different kind of searching there, and it's technically different. This makes it so that it's genealogically helpful to your searching. And you'll find that it's making a great difference. One of the things that's happening because of the developments here, all of which kind of come under the development, under the term artificial intelligence, which is a really broad area and has lots of different components. But one of the advantages here with CAI is that you can build pedigrees. So if you find for instance, an obituary in a newspaper, if the program is set up properly, it will extract the names and the relationships and create a family tree. So you can actually do computer-aided family trees from a will or from an obituary or from a deed or from almost any other any document. You can start to analyze it in that fashion. So if that sounds a little bit in the future, it's really not. It's actually going on right now. It's available. There's, in fact, computer-aided or computer-generated family trees on Family Search right now in the genealogies section. And you go to, by the search tab, go down to genealogies and scroll through the different types of products they have on there, and you'll find computer-generated trees. So there's lots of that going on. It's just it hasn't quite. It is something that is growing so rapidly and moving so rapidly that I can't even say that next week there won't be something dramatically different that happens and creates a whole new area of ability to search this information. So to some extent, once you get into the digital copies and you've got the way to identify the words, and there's lots of, by the way, there's lots of optical character recognition or OCR programs that are available. Adobe, Acrobat, Word. A lot of programs have a built-in OCR capability, and if you do a search online for OCR available programs, you'll find there's lots of them. So you can do your own OCR. But let's start with the newspaper portion and the focus of this presentation with the Library of Congress. It's known to the library people, and having lived in libraries for the greater part of my life, it's known as LOC. So that's the short term for the Library of Congress, not to see. And you'll see that its address down there is chroniclingamerica.loc.gov. So if you need to know the address for the Library of Congress, it's very simple. It's just loc.gov. So they have what's called Chronicling America, Historic American Newspapers collection. And this presently has about 20 million pages. When you compare that to the commercial programs like newspapers.com, that is not a whole lot of records. But the answer is that sometimes more isn't necessarily helpful to you, because more doesn't mean it has what you want. And you may be surprised by doing research here. When you're on Chronicling America, you can just do a regular search. There's a search tab right there. But I would always do an advanced search, and that will give you some very specific information. this shows you that the number today is, well, as of this week when I updated this, is 20,708,769. That number may be larger. They are regularly adding to it, but they're not adding to it at quite the rate of the commercial enterprises. What else has happened? Well, when the Library of Congress began the process of this a number of years ago to begin digitizing newspapers and getting them computer aided, indexed so that they could be searched and search every page and all the words, then basically they also got grants through the government to have other digital newspaper projects created in different states. So they offered subsidizing the digitizing process and making the website process for different websites throughout the country. And now there's one in every single state of the United States. That little national digital newspaper program, you'll see on there from 2005 to 2023. And there's kind of the country is green, which means if you click on any state, you're going to get some kind of a digital newspaper program. And the key to this is that these are these are free programs. They're not the only free programs, because we're going to talk about a lot of other places too. But we got to start right here. A few years ago, I decided I was going to write a blog about free digital newspaper websites. And I was traveling back and forth from Provo to Salt Lake on what's called the Front Runner, which is a train. And it takes about an hour. So every day I had a couple of hours as I went back and forth to work on it. I thought, well, I could pump this out in about a day or two. About 3 months later, I had finally, at least from my standpoint at that time, got a substantial list of all of the newspaper websites just in the United States. And so what I'm starting to say here is that there are just more than you can possibly find in the matter of just a few minutes online. If you think, oh, well, I just looked and there aren't any, then you're probably not using all the right terms, and you're not spending the time you need to look at all this, because it's going to be there. But here's a good place to start with this National Digital Newspaper Program. Now, for example, here in Utah, we have a digital newspaper project sponsored by the University of Utah and others. And it's very, very, very complete. It goes clear back into pioneer days here in Utah, and a lot of information. And you can spend a long time, if you've got people here in Utah, to finding your ancestors. I mentioned when you're working on the Library of Congress Chronicling America website that you should do a specific search, an advanced search. And here you can see that you can select states that you want to search. You can select the specific newspapers that are available, and you can search by years. And you'll see that it goes back to 1770, and that's pretty early for any newspapers to be in the United States and America. But there are some colonial newspapers, and there's records and there's places to search for all the colonial newspapers. So this is not a one-stop shop any place on the internet, no matter what. Even the big commercial websites are not one-stops. They're not, just because you don't find it on a website like newspapers.com does not mean that it hasn't been digitized, isn't on the internet, and isn't free. So that's the important thing to understand. So here what we're doing is we're going to enter a search. In this case, I put in some search terms here. I said with the phrase, and I just put my great-grandfather's name in, Henry Tanner. And then I said all the words, and in this case, I put in Joseph City, Arizona, which is where he lived. And that was it. I mean, I didn't come in with a date range or anything else. And here he is. Here's Henry Tanner and S.M. Porter. And even though it was Joseph City, it found St. Joseph and Henry Tanner, which was the prior name before 1924, was the name of the town. So here's the kinds of things you're going to find, and you'll have the whole newspaper page to look at. In the area of, if I do start looking for my Arizona ancestors, the ones that lived in Arizona, came in pioneer times, almost any newspaper that I pull up is going to have names of somebody in my family. And usually I've had one newspaper page, front page of one newspaper, have as many as a dozen or so or more of my relatives mentioned. They all went to the same schools. They had basketball teams. They paid taxes. They had parties. They had 4th of July and things like that. In other words, all the celebrations, everything, the newspapers reported all of that. And like the simple thing that was interesting was my grandfather, who also lived in northeastern Arizona. It's reported when he came home to visit his mother, and they had Thanksgiving dinner and things like that. So, I mean, almost everything you can imagine is in these newspapers. Well, let's put it this way: it's more than you can imagine. You'll be just overcome with the amount of detailed information you'll start to receive if you do these searches. It's just remarkable. One of the early things that we found when we first got into this, Ann and I, my wife and I, as we were searching, we found out that her father had played the accordion on a radio station on a regular Wednesday evening presentation up in the town in Utah on the radio. Absolutely knew nothing about that. And those are the kinds of things you might be really surprised to find when you get searching in newspapers. Some of the stories I've gotten out of newspapers are absolutely incredible. The second part of the Library of Congress Chronicling America website is the kind of purplish colored link up there that says U.S. Newspaper Directory 1690 to the present. What that means is that as far as they know, the Library of Congress has made quite an effort to identify all of the newspapers that have been published in the United States and America, let's call it North American continent. And so far as this page says, they have identified 157,528 different newspapers. And what they do with a search here, you search by state, city, and county. And I would suggest city searches and county searches. So where would you find the article? My great-great-grandfather lived in southern Utah in a town called Beaver. It's not the only town in the United States that called Beaver, by the way, but Beaver, Utah. And when he died, his obituary showed up about 300 miles away in Ogden, Utah. So you never know. One of the things that's important is if a story is interesting, then it might have been picked up, syndicated across the country. So even if it happened in a very small county in Oklahoma or Alabama or wherever, if it had any newsworthiness, it may have gotten picked up and spread across the country. You might find it in a half a dozen or more or lots of newspapers, especially if it's something sensational. You never know. Or really unusual, like a two-headed calf or something like that. This is the kinds of things that you can never predict. You cannot predict what may show up in these newspapers and where it might show up. So doing general searches across a lot of different newspapers is important, but it's particularly important to do newspaper searches on statewide newspapers and local newspapers, county newspapers, and especially if it turns out there's only one or not too many newspapers in the county, the other counties, surrounding counties, or even a county somewhat distant may be carrying the stories from that county simply to increase its circulation. So you cannot figure out every single county, every kind of relationship is going to be different. And you just have to be systematic as a genealogical researcher to spend the effort to go beyond the town, beyond the county, beyond the state to see if you found additional information. Okay, so this is where it is. It's the U.S. newspaper directory, 1690 to the present. And it's right there on the same website as Chronicling America with the other collection, with the collection of newspapers. Now, this doesn't have the newspapers. This has the name of the newspaper. So then you can see when the newspaper was printed, published, when it was made available, the time frames. So it'll tell you between. If they only have some limited copies of that, then usually you can go from there and then make searches online for that particular newspaper to find out who has the copies of that newspaper. And we'll keep talking about that as I go along. So here's their general article and explaining about how this all was put together. And this is once again on the Library of Congress. And it's just a general article, and it explains how to find a newspaper, what about current newspapers, historical newspapers, all of the information. So this is a good place to get started to get some sort of additional idea. And the newspapers are held in microfilm, print, and digital formats. Now, the microfilm and print formats are what are being digitized presently. They could still be in microfilm and they could still be in print format. Now, one question that came up initially was, how current are the newspapers? Well, the newspapers are very current. It just depends on where you look for the newspaper. If you want a newspaper that was published in the last, say, 10 years, you may need to go to the library, a public library, or any kind of library, a university library or a private library, wherever, and see if they have copies of that particular newspaper. I used to go into the Mesa, Arizona, the Mesa Public Library before had newspaper, before all this was online and before there were computers, and they had all the current newspapers. So if I needed to do some research into some current newspaper holdings, then I needed to go in the library, pull the microfilm, and get on their microfilm reader and look for the new pages that were on microfilm. In some cases, they had the actual physical printed newspaper. That's what we mean by print. They had the paper. And so you could go to the checkout place wherever they were storage checkout, and you could ask for the newspaper, and then you read it there in the library. And they had some kind of sometimes they had limited copying services. Today, you pull out your smartphone, you've got the copy of the article. Now, if you're copying articles from any newspaper, here's the number one rule: copy the date, the place, the page, the name of the newspaper, and the place where it was published. If you copy an article and don't have that information, it is like a ship floating out in the middle of the ocean. Really might be really interesting, but it's not very useful to genealogical research, because we need to know the date that the article was published. We need to know where, when, and some more information. And the way to do that today is to make sure you get a copy of the entire page, including the heading. And if you look at the heading, make sure that it has the name of the newspaper. And if it doesn't, go to the title page or the first page or the front page or of the newspaper and get a copy of that, so you have that information. Because you're going to have a real difficult time trying to go back and find an article if it doesn't have that, especially if it turns out to be the newspaper that has yet to be digitized. So here's what would look like the directory. This is another way of searching for it in the Library of Congress, from this, not in the Chronicling American collection, but this is the digital collections of the directory of U.S. newspapers in American libraries. So any library that's affiliated with the Library of Congress will have, and that's almost every one of them in the entire country, by the way, would have its collection listed here of what it has. And so this is kind of the master collection of the newspapers that are out there. So let's kind of look here. This is some more information from the Library of Congress. And this is the News Navigator. And it's got a video presentation here on telling you how to find what to search for and what kinds of things you might want to find in the newspaper. And, it's important. For instance, when I was a teenager, I had a close friend and I knew he had passed away. And of course, it was many years after we had been associated. I had kind of lost track of him. I hadn't talked to him and found out that he died, but it had been some time period before. It was by going back through the newspaper collections that I found articles and obituaries and things that told how he had died. He had died in an airplane accident. So that came out in the newspapers. So it's just a matter of doing your searches and understanding that as you go along, there's always going to be another place to look. It may seem frustrating at first until you get used to to living in this kind of environment where we have so much information that it's incomprehensible. And since we can't comprehend what we have to have methodology. We have to have some way of working with vast amounts of information like newspapers. When you start looking at newspapers.com, they claim they have 900 million copies. They're coming up on, or 900 billion copies of whatever it is. Anyway, just an unimaginably large number of newspaper pages. So unless we have a way to get to that information without having to go through all of the pages, and that doesn't mean that it's probably not that useful. Now, what's happened, as I've already mentioned and explained, is that the indexing programs that we have today through this computer-aided indexing gives a vast amount of information available through searches on practically any subject. So that's why this is something that's even more valuable than it was 10 years ago or any time in the past. Here's an idea. They have also the Library of Congress has also identified, so let's call it ethnic groups or interest groups, and then shown where the newspaper coverage was for that particular group. So here's an opening into African American history that you may not have taken advantage of in the past. And you can do the same thing for almost any ethnic group or any religious group or any political group or anything else that your ancestors may have been a part of. So here's the kind of the caution when you're out looking for newspapers. Watch out for the word free. Free does not mean free, and free does not always mean what you think it might mean, and is another all sorts of stuff. In other words, it's not a very good word. It doesn't really have any kind of meaning in the real world. So what does that mean? It means that when you go to something like this one, which is Purdue University, and they come up as this guide lists free access to historic newspapers by state. It says that. So when you start clicking on this, it may very well be that you end up getting newspapers.com, and it may be charging for a view. And you're saying, hey, wait a minute, I thought this said it was free. Here's the catch here, folks. This is Purdue University. When they say free, they mean to the students, staff, and professors of Purdue University. They're not saying everybody in the world is going to look at this stuff. So that's kind of the interesting situation that we find ourselves in at the BYU Library Family History Center. We're part of the library at Brigham Young University. And we have access there while we're there at the library. We have access to just overwhelming number of databases and information that's just all free. It's only free, though, if you're a student, staff, or professor. And so even then, even if you're in the library, for example, and you're doing the search, it still may not be accessible unless you have the ID number from a student ID number or whatever. So there's a question here of whether it's free. Now, if you go into the library to do research and you need to get into these kinds of things, it would depend on the library. It would depend on what the librarians are willing to do, and it's whether or not there's some kind of charge for this research or time or whatever. So you just need to be aware that free doesn't always mean free. And one of the things that you need to be very well aware of as a genealogist is the Internet Archive. This is archive.org. That's the address. Just type in archive.org. You've got this. Not archives with an S, not archive.com or archive, anything like that. It's just archive.org, archive.org. So why? Well, this is presently the largest totally available library in the world. The number of documents here is in the billions, billions, and billions. And so basically what you're looking at are it's a very sophisticated, very, I call it not easy place to do searches. But it's always a good idea, no matter what you're looking for. If you're looking for genealogical books about your ancestor or any kind of mention in an old colonial newspaper or any place, anything you think of that you might want to try to find as a genealogical researcher, any place in the world actually, is you need to check here. This is the largest collection. There's right now close to 39 million completely digitized books on this website, books and manuscripts. And so you're talking about a library that very easily exceeds the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress may have more items, but not a very large percentage of them are digitized and made available online, especially not through the Library of Congress. But this is a huge collection, and without searching here, you basically are ignoring one of the basic, I would call it basic 5 resources for genealogy if you don't use it. Google originally started out to create a huge book and newspaper collections. They got sued continually until they won the majority. I don't know if they ever lost a lawsuit, but the major lawsuit that would have stopped them from doing the digitizing and putting them online, they won that at the United States Supreme Court. So basically they have a huge collection, and they have a lot of newspapers, and they have a lot of books, and they are divided into categories. And the categories, of course, are that you can look at the entire page because it's in the public domain. It has no copyright restriction. You can do a portion of it because it's searchable, it's completely searchable, or it's simply copyrighted too new and they're not going to deal with it, and so you can't see it. The advantage of going to the Internet Archive is that it's a library, and so there are copyrighted materials on the archive.org that you can search and read. And so even if it's copyright protected, you need to go to the archive.org and look at that kind of thing. That was what I said at the bottom of the page, was you can search the Internet Archive from Google. That's another interesting thing. Everything on the Internet Archive is searchable from Google. So if you go on and do a search for a book, just put Internet Archive after it or archive.org after your search, and it'll specifically come up with items on the Internet Archive. If it's not there, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean it's not digitized, and it doesn't mean you can't find it. It just means that there's other places you have to go to look. Now, one of the things, if you want to do the search, is to basically do a search for free daily newspapers, free newspapers, and I'd put in digital, free digital newspapers, and then you're going to get things like this Wikipedia list of free daily newspapers, and this is just a very small amount of information off of this particular one. There's lots more entries on this particular Wikipedia page. So, this is a way to get into and find out if they're there and begin the process of seeing if there's a copy of that newspaper someplace that you can look at online, or who might have it, or if it's listed in the Library of Congress, or if it's on one of the commercial websites or whatever. This is another option, and it's called Fulton Search. And it's the guy who runs this is up in Fulton, New York, Old Fulton, New York, and he's collected all of this and digitized it and has a fairly sophisticated way to search it. And it's basically free in the sense that there's no charge for it, although since it is kind of a nonprofit thing, then they're going to say, get us some money. Originally, I said there was the National Digital Newspaper Project. So when you get into that and you start seeing all the states that had the collections, then you're going to see that this is a historical documents records, and it's going to tell you how many newspapers there are. For instance, here in this particular one from Illinois, it says that the cost of newspaper digitation is probably $1 a page. Well, if I were paid for every copy of every newspaper or every digital copy I made at $1 a page, I'd be a lot more wealthier than I am now. But that may be true from the standpoint of the overhead of the university or the overhead of the country or the state or whatever. But there's high-speed digitizing equipment. The problem is that in order to digitize a whole page of newspaper, you need a specialized digitizer, a huge piece of equipment that can handle an image that is the size of a regular newspaper page. So those are very, very expensive. And the time for hiring people to sit there and do that is expensive. So, over time, that may be the cost. I don't think that, for example, newspapers.com has 900 billion pages or something like that, or billions of pages that they've actually spent that much money per page, $1 per page to get that information. That maybe that's true. Who knows? Here's a screenshot of the Utah digital newspapers. And in this case, the state has a very, very thorough and very expensive newspaper. You need to be able to do advanced searches and understand how to do that. It's very frustrating to search for a common name unless you begin to add additional information through an advanced search and focus in on an individual. This is a state library that has newspapers for historical and genealogical research. And as I said initially, these are examples of what I'm doing here is showing examples of places where these records are available for free from these particular organizations. And you can read about where they come from and what they have and their coverage and which newspapers and which years they have here, and the indexes and the way to search them. So this is what I would suggest you get into on the initial level of what kinds of going on. Now, there are worldwide, I've focused here so far entirely on the United States and previous in the colonies, whatever. But if we look further afield across the world, then we may find more, a lot more. This is called Elefind, elefind.com, and it's creating a world's historical newspaper archive. And it's basically to search for that, plus digital copies. If you looked closely at this, you'd see it. They have about 3.5 million copies from Chronicling America. Well, Chronicling America now has 20 million copies. So this one website is not going to have everything on every other website that's out there, but it may give you additional ideas about websites, not only in the United States, but worldwide, and all in different languages too. That's another thing that's important to understand, is that when immigrants came to the United States, they spoke the language they left with. So if they came from Germany or from France or from Croatia, what used to be some of the Eastern European countries that have all changed their names, and or places around the world, they congregated in settlements together, and so they could. There's newspapers in all those different settlements, and you may have to do a broader search to come across the German newspapers that were published in places like Pennsylvania, or the Scandinavian newspapers that were published in the Midwest and up into Michigan, Wisconsin. And there's lots of other ethnic and language newspapers. So this is back. This shows you a screenshot of Google News, which is the newspaper collection on Google. And it tells you what they have. And it's searchable. And so you'll be able to get there. And then also there's another list of archives. Now, there's a difference between listing the newspapers and listing the archives. These are listing where the places around the world that have library collections. Some of these are digitized, some of them are images only, some of them are free, some of them are pay. But this is another large list in Wikipedia of newspaper archives. The reason I've done this is to show that you need to search under different heading. You have to be aware of the way you would search in a library, where you would search under all sorts of different terms in order to get the information you need. Obviously, there's a huge British collection at the British National Archives. They have the BritishNewspapers.com, which, by the way, is also a paid site. And you can get a lot of newspaper information, but there's some of it which is free. And don't forget, local public libraries may have the newspaper collections, as I spoke of briefly. They may have it on microfilm, they may have paper. So it's sometimes you have to travel some places to get your research. And one of the things, if you're going to travel, you might as well talk to people in the public libraries where your ancestors lived, because you never know what kind of information they may have that would be genealogical. Also remember, historical societies, genealogical societies, and museums can also have newspaper collections. So this is the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society, and it's got an online historical New York newspapers. And it's basically a guide to finding those directories and where those newspapers are located. Another source is university special collections. Libraries, they may have newspaper collections. And in fact, it's almost inevitable that they do, because they might have the university publication, the newspaper printed by the university students or the faculty or the university itself, and they would have the archive copies of the university. If your ancestor attended a university, you may want to go to the university and look at their library collections of historical documents, because they may have some stories that talked about your ancestor. There are state libraries. Arizona State Library collection has a microfilm digital collection and also print newspapers at the Arizona State Library. Almost every state in the United States has a state library, and there are some states that don't, and they have some political reasons for that. But It's one thing you need to check in addition to all the other places that I've mentioned. You're not searching through the same things. You may get some overlap, but you may find that the state library or archives has the documents when nobody else does. It just happened to be preserved there. So they might have it, and they may have some of it or all of it digitized. So finding the newspapers is a skill of the fundamental genealogical historical research. When I start talking about fundamental genealogical or historical research, I'm talking about doing research in the site, in situ, of the places and the records that exist in that particular area. Okay, well, thanks for watching.